Good afternoon, and a slight departure from our normal interviews. Today we're having a panel discussion. The budget is on Friday, and I'm joined by my far right, Craig Simmons, lecturer in economics at Bermuda College, John White, president of the Chamber of Commerce, and Cheryl Packwood, who for a long time was Bermuda's representative in Washington, and who you also may remember was a panelist on our live election night. It seems like a long time ago now. And we're going to talk about the budget. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Great being here.
Just a general question. There's an awful lot of internal pressures affecting Bermuda at the moment. I off the top of my head, I came to about 7 or 8. Keeping the cost of business down, the debt, obviously balancing the budget, creating new jobs and businesses. Starting with you, Craig, and we'll work in, if you like. What do you see as the biggest internal pressures? And I specifically say internal because I want to come on to the external threats later on.
I would say the debt, because that constrains a government in terms of the social programs that it can offer. The recession has been let's say anemic, or the recovery has been anemic at best, and I would tend to think that a lot of governments would like to spend some money, but with debt to GDP ratio hovering around sort of 40–45%, your ability to spend is severely limited. So that's why I would say that the debt is the biggest internal restriction.
John?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, first of all, I guess I have to caveat by saying that even though I'm the president of the chamber, I guess my views today are my own views, and we haven't canvassed the membership. So,
understood.
But I agree. I think that the debt is the biggest challenge we have. I mean, $2.5 billion before and $1.5 billion underfunded.
Before pensions taken into account.
Liability for pensions and health. I mean, that's a pretty staggering number. $500,000 we pay per day for interest on the debt before we even pay back the debt. So I think the challenge for government will be to grow the economy, while at the same time understanding that we don't have a lot of excess cash to be able to fund some projects that we would otherwise be able to fund when times are good.
Well, we'll certainly come on to the growth later on, because I know that was a big part of the pre-budget report that the Premier released. But Cheryl, what do you think the biggest problem is?
I agree. The debt is restraining us from doing the things that we need to do in terms of social programs. But if you go beyond that, debt normally is not a bad thing. If you can service your debt was supposedly used to do things, build schools, build roads, provide social programs, provide for this, even provide for the living wage, although I don't think that should come out of debt. So debt is not in and of itself a bad thing. What we are lacking, and I think part of our biggest challenges, is trying to find that vision of how are we going to get out of the crisis we're in. Bermuda has not, its economy has not grown since the last time, in 2008, during the first financial crisis. Our economy has been constricted. It has been constrained. It has not grown. It has been reduced ever since. And that's 8 years, 9 years if 2017 is the same thing. And we're doing the same thing, and we're not coming out of this crisis. And unless we come up with a vision for, as Premier Burt is talking about, grow the economy. If we grow this economy, then the debt is no longer a problem. It's no longer an internal pressure on us.
One of the themes throughout the pre-budget report and in various interviews the Premier has done is growth, and we'll certainly come on to that because it touches on your point about the anemic recovery. Before we go on there, though, I mean, obviously the biggest chunk of revenue for government is tax, and the pre-budget report, which I've referenced, talks an awful lot about taxes, and I just want to read part of it. Payroll tax will become an increasingly problematic source of income as Bermuda's comparative advantage to international companies as a place to do business is eroded through reductions in the rates of corporation tax elsewhere. And it talks about looking at other forms of revenue, but then it goes on to specifically about the payroll tax that government is considering not moving ahead with the implementation of the second phase of the payroll tax proposal put forward by the former government, and that was a progressive tax. Do you think this is the right thing to do, Craig?
Well, in light of the tax reform that happened in the U.S. recently, I could see the logic behind the finance minister's not making it more progressive. He did say that he would continue with the cuts at the bottom half. So
I was going to come on to that. Yes, he did actually say he would lower payroll tax for the lower income people,
which was a part of the original plan. And as I said, I have some sympathy, some empathy for his resistance to make payroll taxes more progressive. But at the same time, I think we need to move in the direction of tax harmonization between the other factors of production. I mean, as the fiscal responsibility report stresses, that labor is really the only factor of production that comes in for tax. We live in essentially a capital tax-free environment. To some extent, we live in a rent tax-free environment. And I think we could do ourselves, from a macroeconomic perspective, a favor by moving in the direction of tax harmonization. By that I mean taxing basically all of these factors of production at more or less the same rate, rather than leaning so heavily on labor, which is another way of saying leaning on working class people.
But there are other, I'll come on to it because I want to talk about these things in detail, but the Premier has proposed other taxes. John, what do you think about this payroll tax and the lack of progressivity, for want of a better word?
You know, first of all, when it was announced in last year's budget that the tax rates would change to be higher at the higher level, we, the Chamber at that point, came out very strongly in favor of a progressive tax system because we felt that there was an inequality in Bermuda that had developed over a long period of time that had to be corrected, and it wasn't going to be corrected overnight, but one way to address it was to adopt a progressive tax system. So certainly as a general principle, we were very much in favor of that. And at that point in time, it was very easy to have a first phase, second phase calculation for how this would work. But I think, as Craig alluded to, with the passage of time, with the tax reform, with all the external factors that I guess we'll get into later in this discussion, it makes it more problematic to ensure that we continue to succeed with international business prospering in Bermuda. So I think that it probably is a good thing to step back and just determine whether the tax rates that were discussed last year are now appropriate for the incoming budget. So we are in favor, I am in favor of just looking at this carefully, because we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot by having a tax that's so progressive and so oppressive on labor that we actually defeat the purpose of trying to increase revenues by having labor move to other islands, other parts of the world. And as we know, in 2018, labor moves much more freely than it used to. So it's a very delicate balance for the Premier and the entire government.
It is a tricky one, isn't it? That I don't know if you agree or not, Cheryl, but you increase the cost, it's more likely to be outsourcing of people. I mean, in terms of...
But yeah, on the other hand, if we went forward, because we are in a situation where we need the money, and we went forward and with the concept that it's just for this year, and meanwhile we are going to review and reform completely our tax system. Right now our tax system is designed for the international business economy that we have. And I mean, in the pre-budget report and all of the various articles throughout all of the media and all of the Premier's pre-budget forum, it's all about growth, and we want to diversify our economy. If that's the case, then we're going to have a completely different tax system. And so, to the extent that I think companies have budgeted in this, usually when you've been told a year, 2 years in advance you're going to get this new tax hike, they will budget that in, and it's already in their costs and in their budgets, and they know it's coming. And that is a good thing, because businesses want certainty, and this is certain, it's coming. And then you tell business, well, we actually think that this is a burden, but we are in a situation where we need this money, and we are going to go through a whole tax reform and rehaul, and we will come back to you for consultation, and indeed, maybe it won't be a labor tax, because I agree with Professor Simmons that when you're taxing labor, you're basically taxing the poor people. And one of the problems with our whole tax system is that we're not just taxing the poor people, but it's all local Bermuda that is supporting our government when we have a whole thriving business community, and there's something very unfair and inequitable about that.
Of course, I mean, the thing with international business, I suppose, just to use a catch-all phrase, they pay more than a quarter of all payroll tax for a government already.
But they're paying that, but the payroll tax is paid primarily on lower salaries. It's not paid on the high-income salaries.
Well, okay,
it's not paid, the wealthy are not supporting our government. It's the poor people that are supporting our government, our lifestyle, everything that we do in this country.
A couple of issues there. The Premier did say that the government still intends to lower the rates of payroll tax for lower income workers. We haven't got a crystal ball, but what would your guess be the percentage rate drop? What do you think he can afford to do? Would it be
He can only afford to do it if he also increases the tax rate on the high wage earners. And otherwise we're going to have an issue with our deficit, and then we've only, I think my understanding is the debt is at 2.47, Professor
Billion?
Simmons? Billion, sorry.
Yeah.
So we have 30 million left before we hit our cap.
Yeah, so
we
it's
don't
probably going
really
to have to be a supplement.
So we can't, but what's $30 million going to do us? So he can't, it would be great if, I think that he should reduce the tax to zero, at least what's paid out by the lower worker. Maybe the company continues to pay the tax on that wage. But if you do that, you have to increase the tax rate on the high income earner. Otherwise,
or introduce other taxes, which he's
the
proposing
income,
to do.
that's the revenue. Where are we going to get
He's
it?
also proposing to introduce other taxes. But just going back to this progressive tax, clearly, I guess most companies have worked out what the change in the US is going to mean to them. Do you think there's a chance, or should there be an opportunity for the Premier to revisit this issue once the issues in the States have settled down?
I think there's no doubt. He's in this holding pattern, waiting for things to unfold. But the PLP have consistently talked about inequality. And
progressive.
Which means progressive taxes, which could take the form of, to borrow a page from the U.S. playbook, some earned tax credits, which could in fact have people at the bottom receiving a check from the government. So rather than paying 0% tax, we're talking about people paying a negative amount of tax. And that could arguably be one of the best ways to target people at the bottom. Certainly in the United States, the earned income tax credit system has been sort of described as the best way to target people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder.
Do you see that as being a possibility?
I think it is. The tax commissioner's office is going to need a lot of help.
He's promised more funds for that office. But
that was in fact going to be my sort of final comment. If I could change one thing within the government, it would be to significantly increase the labor power, the human power within the tax commissioner's office to collect some of the outstanding taxes, to implement a government sales tax, and to make that system a system of earned tax credits that could in fact benefit those people at the bottom.
John, do you think this issue of progressive tax will be revisited?
I think it will be. I mean, again, there's no question a year ago the world was a different place, and we didn't have the external challenges that we have today. So I think a lot of issues have surfaced in Bermuda and globally in the last year. So I think it is good to step back and just determine what our best way forward is. So what the answer is, I mean, it's a delicate balance for the government, right?
Craig mentioned the holding pattern. I suppose that's a fair way, perhaps, of summarising it.
But having said that, I mean, the things won't be clarified in the U.S. anytime soon. So I think it could be weeks or months before the U.S. tax reform situation really unfolds to the extent that we understand in Bermuda how it's going to affect us. So I don't think that that the government have the luxury of waiting sort of a couple of weeks or a month to find out exactly what the impact will be on Bermuda. I think they've got to make a decision based on the best available information they have at this point in time.
Just moving on, another thing that was mentioned in the pre-budget report was incentives to repatriate jobs to Bermuda. And quote from it, quickly. We will work very closely with key business stakeholders over the next couple of months to create incentive to relocate jobs to Bermuda, and we'll consider providing payroll tax relief for the repatriation of jobs back to Bermuda. How does that kind of thing work?
That doesn't. In some ways, it's a bit bizarre because it doesn't quite make sense. Many jobs have just disappeared.
Through technology, or
they just don't exist anymore. So you can't repatriate that job. Maybe it did leave in 2008, but since then, maybe that job doesn't even exist anymore. Many of these jobs, even though they can be done virtually. So you have a call center that's in Malaysia, or you have your HR manager, even though your company is Bermuda or Hartford or LA, your HR manager may be sitting in Toronto, and he or she doesn't want to come back to Bermuda. So and they're not going to come back to Bermuda. I'm not quite sure how that works, and
certainly needs to be fleshed out. The detail needs to be fleshed out. We don't know the actual relief
and
yet, for instance.
We're not an economy. We're not a manufacturing economy, at least not at this point. And so, how can you bring back? It's like you talk about repatriating jobs when you're talking in general. I could be very wrong, but
well, I think it's a reaction to a report that came out of the statistics department on immigration, and it was, it indicted Bermuda as being a place that doesn't value its greatest resource, educated people. So of the people, of the individuals that emigrated from Bermuda, I think in the area of 2007, 2011 or 12, more than half of those folks were young. The median age was something like 27 years old. And when you look at the median age of our population, it is heading toward 50.
That's right, yeah.
And half of those people who emigrated were college educated. So I think, if anything, it's probably a political reaction to an indictable report that came out of the government, the statistics department. And so you've got to say something, and perhaps the best thing you could say is repatriation. But as you say, how that actually happens, because the nature of work is changing at a rapid pace. With the evolution of artificial intelligence, I mean, bots are going to be doing increasingly more sophisticated work in every domain, from law to accounting to reinsurance. It's really, really scary to see.
That's not to mention things like blockchain as well, which is going to make it a lot easier to do things.
Yes.
I think also, practically speaking, just there's many employers who, especially during the growth times in Bermuda prior to 2009, they simply couldn't find the qualified people in Bermuda to do some of the roles. So many employers outsourced IT in particular to other jurisdictions because there simply wasn't a qualified workforce. It can take years, really, once you train a person appropriately to do what you need them to do. So it isn't just as easy as saying, take away a job from overseas and bring it back, because you've put so much time and effort into that staff member who's overseas that it becomes problematic to just say, we'll bring the job back to Bermuda. It just doesn't work that easily.
I suppose it's also premised on the basis that there's going to be growth in the economy for the jobs to actually be there.
But that's not repatriation of jobs. That's
but you can't repatriate if you haven't got the growth.
Right. You've got to grow. You've got to create new industries. You've got to, or bring in different businesses, and with those businesses, then those will bring in jobs. But that's not repatriation of jobs. It's a different I see them as different.
We sort of have a chicken and egg situation. I think the training, the retraining and education of the workforce is not something that's knee-jerk. It's not a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that there's been some emigration. There needs to be a serious commitment to educating our population, because let's face it, we don't have the most educated population. When you look at the PISA scores, we're not doing very well. So there's got to be some kind of disruption, if you will, in the education sector, the sector in which I work. There needs to be some kind of revolution where you can, in fact, get value for the dollars that are going into education, because I need to be honest, we're spending quite a bit of money, an inordinate amount of cash on a per capita basis on education. But where is all that education going? Those dollars, are we getting value for money? And I would argue that we're not. And so we've got to do things differently. But of course, there are forces at play within the education sector that's stifling innovation.
Can you expand on that? It's not quite the budget, but I'd be interested to hear your views.
Well, unions are ordinarily a barrier to change. It's about protecting the membership as it exists today. But innovation, involves change. It involves obsolescence, getting rid of people like me in favor of other methods. But of course, that's against the interest of the union.
We'll leave it there because that's a completely different subject, but it's interesting to hear.
That's the next panel.
Yes, the next panel, yes. Just moving on again, there's a lot to talk about, and a lot of it is tax. Now, we've talked about the payroll tax, we've talked about this repatriation idea, and payroll tax relief, but the professional services tax is being talked about, and this is going to be apparently limited initially to services provided in the legal and accounting professions and other businesses in management consultancy services. We haven't got a definition of where it's going to be yet. But John, this is having an effect on costs, won't it, especially for small businesses?
It absolutely will. I mean, if these costs are levied to the lawyers, the accountants, they're going to presumably pass these costs on to their
customers. Lawyers and accountants, we talk about and other businesses and management consultancy services, so we actually don't know yet.
That's a pretty broad range potentially. So yeah, we'll add to the cost of doing business in Bermuda. And I guess the big question is, will it actually increase to the revenue pool or won't it? Because as I mentioned before, with labor traveling so freely these days, if the downside is that the big four accounting firms and law firms start relocating staff to other islands that are lower cost and don't have the same tax, then we've defeated the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. So
this is another thing. Doing my research on this, one person suggested it actually could lead to more outsourcing, never mind repatriating.
Yep.
I don't know if do you see that as a possibility? If it's more costly to do things here, the report will be sent out somewhere overseas to be done, and it will just sort of materialise here and done.
Yes, that definitely can happen. I think that there's a lot of problems with VA. It's a value-added tax. And having worked with value-added taxes when I lived abroad, you also have issues of how you have to of reporting into the government, how much all the different work you're doing, providing all of your financial statements, showing all your bills that you've actually paid out this tax. That's going to also create it'll create jobs in the tax department. I mean, because that's what we'll need reports, and then people have to review the reports, and there'll be audits and so forth. So it's more than just the expense to the businesses, the local businesses. But I also see it as we keep looking for more revenue from the same source, from local people, whether it's the local businesses, whether it's the local employees. We're stuck on the same source of. It's
a small island. Where do you actually get more revenue from?
You grow what Premier Byrd has said. We have to grow our economy, and that's the big. I think that's the haunting question in the end.
It's a $6 million question, but my question would be: if you're increasing costs and you're passing it on to the consumer or whatever, or to the business, you're not going to grow the economy.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. We said the biggest threat is the debt. The only way you're going to pay down this debt is if the tax to GDP ratio increases from where it is now, 16%, in the region of 22 to 23%. And that's according to the Fiscal Responsibility Panel. So we're talking about some significant increase in tax, 6 to 17 up to 22 to 23%. And this has to happen fairly quickly. So the money's got to come from somewhere. We have essentially overtaxed labor. So now you've got to look at the people who have been getting off scot-free. So he's talked about taxing rents, taxing service providers, taxing services in general, as opposed to beating on goods. So people are going to have to understand that if you're going to do business in Bermuda and enjoy the benefits of being in Bermuda, you've got to pay a little bit more. And the question is, how much more before people start to outsource? Like what exactly are the benefits
of
writing?
Are they good enough to compensate for the increased taxes?
Yes.
A commercial rent, is that good enough to compensate for everything? Again, isn't that looking from, I know you can't, you're speaking on your own behalf, but your members are small businesses. If your commercial rent goes up and they're renting an office space, it's just adding to their costs, isn't it?
It isn't. I mean, commercial rents, the commercial owners their taxes were increased last year. So, this talk about taxing commercial rents on top of what they had to pay in addition last year, doesn't bode well with some of our membership. I mean, my view is that, and I've stated this before, is I like Premier Byrd's comment about we need 80,000 people in Bermuda. Now, I'm not saying 80,000 is the right number, but I'm saying that, when people say what happened during the recession in Bermuda and why can't we get out of it, what happened essentially was that we lost 5,000 people, or whatever the right number is, that didn't return. So we lost people that were paying into the tax system. We lost people that were renting Bermudians' homes, eating in Bermuda-owned restaurants. And this, to me, is the biggest issue we have to deal with. So while it is important to broaden the tax base in Bermuda and have less dependence on payroll tax and import duties, I really believe that we have to have a discussion about having more people in Bermuda pay into our tax base. And from that, you then ask yourself, okay, what's the value proposition to bring businesses here, and how do we make it easier for people to want to come to Bermuda? But I think if our current population is 62,000 people, and we expect that without adding more people to our economy, that we're going to be able to get ourselves out of the debt situation that we're in, I think we're just, our heads are in the sand.
It's all about math. It's purely math.
Well, the chicken and egg is that you do, in order for the economy to grow, you need more people. So it goes without saying that you're going to need to bring people in. I think the PLP used the term balanced work permit and residential policies. Yeah, the two. Getting people in from the outside, hopefully attracting more Bermudians back home, and finding other ways for people to come here and invest in our economy. So now we've moved into the 60-40. Is the 60-40, has its day passed?
Well, apparently not.
There's some suggestion that...
You're talking 60-40, you're talking the ownership rules.
The ownership rules, yes. Yeah. Was it, what was the original intention of 60-40, and what is the role of it today? It's my understanding that it was a way for the oligarchy to protect its interest.
That's what he refers to in a speech he made. I think that's what he refers to.
But if you're going to abolish 60-40, you've also got to look at what are some of the downsides. This economist at the JFK school at Harvard, Danny Roderick, talks about how globalization, as you become more deeply embedded in the global economy, that sort of exacerbates social cleavages. So I can't help but wonder, so if we abolish the 60-40 rule, that means capital coming into Bermuda, people that we've never seen before starting up businesses. What are some of the unintended consequences of having people that are obviously foreign running businesses on Front Street, on Reed Street, the political shifts that accompany that, and the inequality that may follow? We've got to get used to the change.
On the other hand, we've had a massive flight of capital due to the 60-40 rule, because it is impossible for foreign businesses to reinvest whatever they've made back into the country, unless you are unless you've had a special legislation passed, special bill passed that allows you to keep your profits, reinvest if you're, for example, if you're telecom or in the exempt companies. But all of that money, even the exempt companies, the insurance companies, it's going all back offshore.
My point is this: I think we need to have some conversations with the people of Bermuda. It's not enough to say, well, we're going to abolish or we're going to relax the 60-40 rule. There are some unintended possibilities. We saw a lot of pushback with the airport, but yet, we're talking about, the Premier's mentioned an infrastructure fund,
That's right, yeah.
which is a nice way of saying public-private partnerships. Well, the airport was a little idea. If we're going to, in fact, rely on outsiders to fund our infrastructure, and are Bermudians ready for that? Do they understand what it means to have someone owning your infrastructure?
And especially under PPP, there's a big price to pay. John, what do you think about the 60-40 rule being relaxed?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely am in favor of the discussion initially being had, like what are the risks, what are the opportunities, but my view is that in 2018 it has to be done away with in a measured basis. I just don't think that we have the luxury of being able to say that we want to protect local businesses the way that we could have before the recession hit. So I think it did, for better for worse, it protected local business for a long time. But in 2018, I really think we have to have a serious discussion about doing away with it and encouraging foreign capital to come to the island. And as I say, I think to get to 80,000 people, which the Premier has mentioned several times, it's hard to imagine that we can generate that much interest in people coming to the island without doing some things very different from the way that we have been doing them for many, many years. So whether it be 60-40, obviously immigration reform is a very sensitive issue.
That's ongoing as well.
But to say that we don't want to change, but yet we want things to improve, it's simply not going to happen.
Question of change management.
Absolutely. Yeah, but it's all in the communication. So I think I'm really encouraged by what the Premier has done in terms of throwing a number out there, and that's, to me, that's how you start the discussion, by saying we need more people. The discussion from here on is why do we need more people in Bermuda? So I think
and how
It's scary.
Well,
it's scary.
That's a
to
$6 million
people.
question. I was going to ask you how.
It's scary.
Who knows?
I think it's scary to people because it can fundamentally change the culture of the island, how we perceive ourselves, who we are, what we look like. All of that changes once you get a major influx of people into the island. However, there's no question, if we don't increase our population dramatically, we can't grow our economy. I think we also, and we've been talking about the 60-40 rule, abolishing it for years, decades. So I don't know that it has to be that measured anymore. We've done a ton of studies. There's a lot of reports written about it. The BMA has studied this inside and out. The law firms have all studied it and written reports. It had a place in the 1960s. In 2018, it doesn't have a place anymore in a global economy. All it is doing is stifling our economy.
Would you expect to see, well, you guys have talked about the conversation needs to start with the 60-40 rule. The Premier's brought it up already. Would you expect to see, would you be surprised to see him say on Friday, we're abolishing it?
I believe he will. I hope he will. I don't believe it. I don't know what he will. I'm just hoping that
what
he
I'm
will
saying
say that.
would it be the correct thing to do to announce that it's going to be abolished? Would it be the correct thing to do to consult about it?
I think there would be such chaos if he said that. I think the start is we need to seriously understand the issues around abolishing 60-40. So I think that's where the start is.
But John, we've been talking about it and studying it for 20 years. How many more years do we need to keep studying?
Well, I think the Bermuda populace has to be understanding of what that means. I don't think we're anywhere near that position yet. So
I think the Bermuda populace is a very smart populace, and I think if we take a little bit of time to talk to them and inform them, I think that they can grasp it. The problem is that we've been pretty bad at communicating, and we need to change that. And I believe in people. Despite the scores, we are probably one of the most educated group of people on this earth. Everybody in Bermuda, for the most part, and there's a small percentage of people, they know how to read, they know how to write. You can't say that about other countries in the world. So I believe strongly we've got to just start doing things instead of keep studying them.
Well, part of that's going to happen because Belco is probably going to become a foreign company within the next 12 months.
We don't know that. I mean, you're guessing.
Probably. Yeah. And in fact, it's necessary because the company hasn't been performing up to par. When you look at the price of a kilowatt hour vis-a-vis other Caribbean countries, our rates are ridiculously high.
But one of our biggest problems is, it's about vision. I remember when I was in D.C. and I met the ambassador from Aruba, and her president had a vision. We are going to be completely independent of fossil fuels by 2025. And so everything that she does or did was about getting to independence of fossil fuels. We haven't thought that, and that so we don't have a vision. So it goes even to Belco, because Belco is not making any decisions or moves towards that, or they have done a little bit limited paying lip service.
Often when these, like I'm going to use the case of Barbados. Barbados was forced to make a dramatic change, largely because the cost of running its hospitality industry, the principal industry in Barbados, was becoming prohibitive. So they had to act very, very quickly. Barbados was essentially in crisis. And that seems to be, unfortunately, the way humans react. You know, to talk about,
to a crisis.
They have to get to a crisis, and that's why I think Belco, people are sick and tired of the way in which the utility has been running electricity. But I think they're ready to sort of say, okay, let's get rid of 60/40 for the power industry. We've already gotten rid of it for the telecommunications industry. We've gotten rid of it from the financial services. So we've made progress.
We've moved.
There has been progress. Yes. The last PLP government, I think, introduced changes to the 60/40.
Yes.
Just moving on a bit. There is another tax I wanted to discuss. It's, again, a brand new tax, the sugar tax.
The tax that came out of nowhere.
The tax came out of nowhere. And there's lots of sugar taxes around the world.
Yeah.
Good or bad, I don't know.
I look at it from this perspective. Is it a good tax in order to increase revenues? You know, we'll see. But you know, the bigger issue for me is we need to make Bermuda more fit. You know, our diabetes rate in Bermuda, the cost of health care. So anything that we can do to improve the health of Bermudians and bring the cost of health care down is a good thing.
Well, the sugar tax, they actually have a whole educational, I read all the way to the end.
But it's got to be done.
And they've got all of that in there.
Yeah, it does actually be ring fence for health initiatives.
But it's got to be a cohesive view of getting fit. I mean, the sugar tax is only, sugar is only one element of all of us being fit, right? So, if you eat fried chicken but don't eat sugar, there's
a saying that I've heard a lot since the introduction of the sugar tax. You have to be wealthy to be healthy. And if you go around the shops and you want to eat healthily, it does cost you quite a lot. I've been trying.
What's been missing, what I find missing from that consultation is this. Sugar has negative third-party effects. The same can be said of alcohol and tobacco. Alcohol and tobacco have restrictions on their availability. Why not put some kind of restrictions on the availability of sugar? Because it's almost as if we're encouraging, you walk into a gas station or a supermarket and this stuff, this white powder, is sitting at eye level for a 6-year-old. It's hard for a young person to not be face to face with this substance that is doing serious damage to our economy.
And that's a very deliberate placement.
Yes. So why aren't we attacking the issue of availability? Why can't it? I'm not suggesting that you put it in a separate store like alcohol, but it shouldn't be at eye level for children. We should look at the issue of the availability of it and not just look at the price, because otherwise I think you're in many ways pandering to the health experts. You'll collect a little bit of money, but will it really change public attitudes?
So this is it. The jury's out, it seems, on that, whether it changes public attitudes, whether it actually works.
I actually went and did some research when I saw the sugar tax consultation and all the packaged materials, thousands of pages you sent us, Jeremy. And I went and did some research. And yeah, it actually the sugar tax has worked in some jurisdictions. It hasn't worked in others. But there have been significant decreases in the consumption of sodas and sugar type cakes and cookies that are made. I think it's fine. I did like the fact that they had also put in the whole consultation, all this education on getting fit, on walking, on getting companies to. I know some companies, especially the local insurance company, have the equivalent of Fitbit challenges or points, and you can even get a day off in your company every quarter if you reach a certain number of points, and to get people out and walking and eating and learning about food. So that is in here. It is in the consultation, and why not try it? And it will raise a few $1 million and a little bit extra. To
but the out of sight, out of mind, I think, is an important piece.
I like the availability. I hadn't thought about that, but that also goes for sodas that are in the, you know, in the cabinets, in the freezer, in the refrigeration section of the grocery store. Should they be put up high, or even the sodas that aren't in the refrigerator, that should they be put up high so the kids aren't looking at?
Because the suggestion in that consultation is that this is a poison, like tobacco and alcohol. So if indeed you're going to use that strong language, maybe we need to go beyond just fiddling with the price.
Let's move it around. Let's have, and that could come. That would come, I would hope, with regulations. It doesn't necessarily. It should be maybe an addendum to the consultation.
And but it's not even mentioned in the
They haven't done the social research on that.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully they'll listen to this and take that on board as part of the consultation. We've touched on debt a little bit. One thing I did want to ask about, a couple of major issues I wanted to ask about, is balancing the budget. In the pre-budget report, it says the government remains committed to balancing the budget. How likely is this going to be? And how difficult is that going to be?
The big question is when. This was supposed to be the year to balance the budget.
Yes.
So we've kicked the can down the road by 1 year. Now, kicking cans, it seems to be a highly addictive process. So can we believe the government when they say they will balance the budget next year?
How can they?
Well,
that's my
can
question.
they?
I don't even
I would agree. I don't think it's going to be this year. It won't be next year. I think, you know, it'll be several years down the road, unless we do something different from what we're doing right now. And I just
well, that's pretty radical, though, wouldn't it? If you're saying it might be several years down the road before we balance.
I don't think we can afford the biggest single item. You know, if debt service were a ministry, it would be the biggest
ministry. Yeah.
Well, it's the biggest.
It's the biggest now, is it? Okay.
It's the biggest. If you take all debt service, not just sinking fund contributions,
but right, yeah.
It is the biggest ministry, and it's growing. So the longer you take to balance the budget and start paying down on the debt, this thing will spiral out of control. At the beginning of this discussion, we said the debt was the single biggest problem, which means you've got to first balance your budget. Otherwise, it will continue and get out of control, and we may have to do something drastic like what was done in Barbados several years ago, firing 3,000 public sector workers.
Bob Richards, the former finance minister, always wouldn't go there. And I always assume one of the reasons he wouldn't go there is there's nowhere in the private sector to soak up those jobs. That's not realistic at the moment, is it?
Which is why you need to find a way to take in about $1.2 billion by next year. This time next year, you've got to have a way of raising about $1.2 billion government revenue, and keeping spending below 1.2 so that you can begin the process of reversing this tide. I don't think we have an option of another year. It has to happen in 2019, 2020.
And I go back to the point about we have to have more people paying into our tax system. I just don't see us with 62,000 people generating enough tax revenue to reverse this course. I mean, we have to do things that are maybe considered to be drastic, but we don't have the luxury of waiting to hope that things turn around.
But then you're only going to get there with having a vision, with having a plan.
Yep.
And right now, great, we have this committee to look at this, and this committee to look at immigration, another committee to look at vision, another committee to look, and they're not talking to each other. And unless you have, in some ways, you need that overall authoritarian figure to come and put together a whole plan. But to say that we're going to come up with $1.2 billion in revenues by February 2019, doing what we're currently doing and not and continuing on with these different various committees, and each one they get together for an hour once a week or once every 2 weeks, that's not how you're going to get it done. Well, there's no leadership, there's no vision there. You have to think about what is it that we want to do and how are we going to get there, and you have to put it together. It almost like it's a project.
But it's a point, isn't it, that the government has formed a lot of committees. It's set up things like the Bermuda First, again, it's reincarnated. There's the Immigration Committee, but none of these things are going to happen quickly enough, are they?
Immigration should be tabling things before Parliament. I believe it is in September.
Okay. What I'm saying is none of these things are going to happen quickly enough to avoid kicking the balancing of the budget further down the road, aren't they?
Well, I think we'll have to, there's going to have to be some pain felt until we get to that point in time. So I guess to Craig's point about the 17% of GDP that we currently receive by way of tax revenues to go to 22%, there's going to have to be over the next couple of years more people paying more tax, hopefully through a broadened tax base to achieve that. So that'll be, I think, the short course of action, but the medium and longer term has to be the items that we're talking about.
Because we've got the Tax Reform Commission, and they apparently started work in January. I haven't heard a report if they've actually started or not.
Well, I don't think we're going to hear much, if anything, until at least the second half of 2018. So I don't think, if we expect to hear something back soon from that.
I think they said 6 months initially, but anything I guess they introduced is going to have to wait till the next budget.
But your Tax Reform Commission should also be looking at what is it that you're doing in terms of your economy. Are we looking at diversifying our economy? What businesses are we going to look at bringing into this island? And if they're not all still in the financial services sector business, maybe we would be taxing them differently. And unless the Tax Reform Commission is talking to the Diversity Committee, who's also then talking to the Bermuda First Committee, who's talking to the immigration people, then we're still going to be in the same basket that we are now next year. And I agree 150% with Professor Simmons. I just don't see us getting there. I see
That's
no vision. I see no leadership. I'm sorry.
Should we all get our passports ready and disappear off the island?
No, because we will keep saying this and we will get there. We will, we have to believe this island, we have resources. We're just not tapping into them. We've had 50 years of IB, and we only perceive of ourselves as an IB jurisdiction when there's many other things that we could be doing.
But I just want to follow on this point a little bit. So there are examples where Bermuda's reacted very positively to outside risks that affect our future. So if I look at Solvency II, this was an issue that really affected our reinsurance business, and between the Ministry of Finance and the BMA and the private sector, they responded very appropriately, very effectively to that. So it isn't as though we don't have the intellectual capacity to respond to the issues that face us. We just have to be cognizant of the fact that we have to do it.
Salience I think is the key thing. Something that's salient forces you.
I think eventually, with the whole tax reform that's gone on in the United States, that is going to have a dramatic impact on Bermuda over the next few years. It's going to force us to have to think about what we really can do other than what we've been doing. But until we get into that situation, I'm not seeing foresight. I'm not seeing. I see people paying lip service. I think there was one sentence thrown in about diversifying the economy in the entire 35-page budget report.
Pre-budget
report, I'm sorry. Until we actually feel the effect of the corporate tax rate being brought down to 21% in the U.S. and what that effect is going to eventually have on Bermuda. We can't just keep saying, oh, we're just so well regulated. We're the best regulated island or country.
It is a line that's trotted out a lot, yeah.
It's not, that's not enough, that's not going to be enough anymore.
Because there's two or three things I want to address quite quickly. I remember, I'm pretty sure, I couldn't find the actual report, but the original Bermuda First report, I'm sure, referred to something like 20,000 small businesses that were on this island. I remember it because it was such an enormous amount such an enormous number. John, I know, again, this is your personal thing, but help for small business, what would you like to see in the budget? Is there anything you can do? Because wouldn't this help stimulate growth rather than putting the cost of rent on them? Or
yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for our members, our small businesses, is to have more people in Bermuda to sell their goods and services to. So what they're saying to us as the executive is there's so much emphasis, too much emphasis on import duties and payroll tax. Give us a break from, you can't increase these anymore. Broaden the tax base, bring more people to Bermuda so we can sell more goods and services to. If you're a grocer and you're selling groceries every day, I'm never going to eat more than 3 meals a day. Like, there's nothing more they can do until we get more people to sell their goods and services to. So they're saying broaden the tax base, leave us alone from further increases, and allow more access to people from overseas to come here to work and live, which starts with what's the value proposition that we have in Bermuda for businesses to want to relocate to Bermuda, which to me starts with Cheryl's point before about what's the vision that we have for Bermuda. What do we, when the Premier says we want 80,000 people, that has a lot of connotations to it. Like, what is the vision that government have for the future of Bermuda? That's where it all starts. But they're saying to us, again, we can't continue to absorb the burden of taxes that we do. You know, the easy target is a local retailer, because you can't, this is where they do business in Bermuda. They can't relocate to another island, right? So they're saying it just seems as though they're paying a higher price than they should in the overall context of the fairness of taxation in Bermuda.
For me, it's a chicken and egg situation again. Access to capital. If you want small businesses to grow, they've got to have access to capital. As it stands now, debt is the only option. You go to a bank, and the bank wants, you know, both kidneys and a couple of other essential organs, and it's stifling innovation. So until we can sort of crack that nut, where we can find equity propositions, venture capital propositions for small business to tap into, I think we're going to be sort of stuck on stupid in many ways, because there are entrepreneurs out there with great ideas, but how do you get this thing going? And we know that small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, are major employers. They're the ones that are going to get people working. They're going to be the ones that are going to attract.
They're going to employ the majority of people, aren't they?
Yes, but they need capital.
They need capital.
They need capital, and we still haven't cracked that particular nut.
How would we crack that?
I'm sorry?
How would that be cracked?
That's a great innovation. I mean, just sort of speaking off the top of my head, you could use the concept of two-sided markets, where you would have a particular platform, very much like Google or Facebook, where you would have on one side venture capitalists who are looking to lend money, and on the other side, entrepreneurs who want to borrow the money. And the platform could be the place where there would be anonymity for both the venture capitalist and the potential entrepreneur. But you know, that's sort
But
of
you're going to need some sort of securitization mechanism, and your regulations and
the
legislation.
60-40 would get in the way of that, and,
Well,
and
the
that's another
60-40
reason for
gets in
getting
the way of
About
it, but
60-40,
also just basic concept and laws of security, taking security of some sort, whether it's shares or proceeds.
Well, remember, we're not talking about sort of millions of dollars here. We're talking sort of tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're talking small lending.
You still,
on
once you get over 50,000, it's the bank or your lender is going to want something to $50,000. That is, your bank, your lender is going to want something to ensure somehow that I'll call it the bank gets its money back.
Well, I'm not thinking about banks. In my view,
lender.
we're talking a lender, like an equity partner, as opposed to a lender who's just going to get money
but
regardless.
again, then your 60-40 rule
has to go out.
It
Yes.
has to go out the door,
Exactly.
because they're going to initially want all kinds of agreements.
80%
from
ownership
put, they're going to
of-
want
of-
80%. They're going
yeah.
to want to have put agreements. All sorts of things that we can't handle in our legislation.
Well, we can't handle with 60-40 as it stands
Right.
now, but we're talking about moving ahead, and it has to be a multi-pronged approach.
So the 60-40 rule, the abolition of that completely becomes quite important then,
Absolutely.
Oh, for
yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
If you're going to grow small business,
regardless of what the voting public might think. It's a really crucial thing to do.
And we're going to also have to look at land ownership too, eventually. And that's been moving slowly along with, condos, but for certain people. But I think that has to also eventually. We live in a global world. We don't just live in the middle of the Atlantic.
And I think we've got to grow the Hamilton base. I mean, it's when you drive out of town at 7 o'clock at night, there's not much there during the week. I mean, it could be revitalized if we had a different approach to allowing foreign capital to come in. And I know it may be a scary thought for a lot of people, but this is the reality of if we want to improve the fortunes of people in Bermuda, we have to be thinking about other ideas. And one of them is to allow, foreigners to invest in property in Bermuda, especially I think in the Hamilton area, to make it livable.
And we're going to have to build up. We've got to go beyond the cathedral. We have to build up because we have to put these You say 80,000, or Premier Burt says, I think we eventually have to get to 120,000, but you have to put them somewhere, which means you have to build up. And you don't necessarily have to build up in every space in the island. You can create certain zones that where you build up. You can go up 20, 40, St. David's maybe, or Dockyard. There are places you say, okay, we're going to build up. Just like Paris. Their business, in the city of Paris, you can't build above like 8 stories. But they created La Défense, where you have these major buildings. Now, we don't have to have as big a building as in Paris, but obviously we can grow up and we can create those hubs.
It's going to be interesting. The Premier did refer to it as one of the sacred cows, and it's going to upset potentially a lot of the voting base. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Living wage, and it's not necessarily to do with the budget. One definition of a living wage is a minimum income necessary for a worker to meet their base needs. Is this a good idea for Bermuda?
Well, the living wage for me is part of an engine for growth. Inequality, I think it's been pretty much proven to be a brake on growth, because people at the very top, I mean, much of the growth that's happened in the 21st century, the gains of growth and globalization have gone to a narrow group of people who aren't really spending the money. So the literature, at least that I'm reading, suggests that making the society more equal will in fact boost, it's good for growth over the long term. Now, how do you bring that about? I mean, there are sort of maybe 2 or 3 different models. There's the universal income idea, which is clearly unaffordable. There are what some people call negative income taxes, which is sort of a first cousin of guaranteed income. There's the earned tax credit system that I mentioned earlier. And then there's coming up with policies or building on the systems that we already have in place in Bermuda to target those in the bottom quintile or quartile. And that would be boosting financial assistance, getting reasonable health care and child care and public transportation to those at the bottom. Those are things that you can actually do to make a real difference, and it would be affordable, because there is this problem of, now, how exactly are we going to pay for this? How can we make it tax neutral? And so by making it a targeted program, I think you can save yourself a lot of money.
Cheryl, do you think it's a good idea?
Yes, I do. I think that there's a lot of reasons why we need a universal or a minimum living wage. Part of it is some jobs are gone and they're never coming back. Some people, and hence some people will never work again. And if we are a humane society, and the world is moving towards being a humane society, and Bermuda is part of this world, then we have to look somehow at that. Is that living wage? I don't think that's going to happen in the next year or the next 5 or 10 years. Until we effectively grow our economy and increase our tax base, we're not going to be able to provide that minimum living wage. Theoretically, academically, as a humanitarian, I absolutely believe in it, and I would like to see Bermuda work towards that as a goal.
John, is that just another cost to small business? Is that sustainable?
Yeah, I don't see it as being sustainable. I think in theory it sounds good, and I agree that it'd be nice to be able to be in a position where we have a surplus where we could do that in Bermuda, but I don't see that as being a practicality. So I think minimum wage is in my view, the next best thing, and I think that is being discussed. We've discussed amongst certain of our chamber sectors, and that seems to be overall generally accepted as being the most affordable and practical way to address some of the inequity in our population at the moment.
Many of the northern countries have, or some of the northern European countries have moved towards actually implementing a living wage.
A living wage, yeah.
And as I have said, I don't think we can do it now. I'm looking at the now, but I do think that it's something we should work towards. So I agree with you that now it's it's part of, we've got a tax base that we can't afford, we've got revenues we can't bring in, and so, yeah, no, it's not doable.